The door to the 38th floor conference room opened at 9:47 a.m., and nobody standing behind it was who anyone expected. The boy was 12, maybe 13 if you were being generous. He wore a gray uniform shirt that fit him the way a tent fits a fence post. The sleeves rolled twice. The collar loose around a neck that hadn't grown into the fabric yet. A battered ID badge hung crooked at his chest. His backpack was the kind that had been good once, before 3 years of hard use, had left the bottom seam gray-stitched and the right strap repaired with electrical tape. He walked with his shoulders squared and his chin up, which was the only thing about him that looked practiced. Every person seated at the long conference table turned to look. 7 executives. 12 years of combined postgraduate education between the nearest 3. Coffee cups and audit folders and the particular species of tension that lives in a room where numbers haven't matched for 2 quarters in a row. The woman at the head of the table looked up last. Sophia Laurent, CEO of Meridian Systems Group, was 36 years old and had not taken a full vacation since the previous administration. She wore her hair back. She wore her expression the same way. "Who are you?" one of the directors asked. The boy met Sophia's eyes. His voice shook in precisely one place, then steadied. "My dad's sick," he said. "So I came instead." 3 of them laughed. The laughter was the comfortable kind, the kind people reach for when something confuses them and embarrassment seems worse than cruelty. Sophia did not laugh. She was already reading the badge. The name printed on it was Carter, D. Facilities and Maintenance Level 2 Clearance. She didn't know why her hand stopped moving. She just knew, before the boy said another word, that the next 60 seconds were going to change something she had considered finished. Daniel Carter was 38 years old, and he woke up at 4:15 every morning, which was not something he'd chosen so much as accepted. The alarm was the cheap digital kind, red numbers in the dark. He silenced it with the muscle memory of a man who had been doing this for 4 years and did not want to wake his son. He dressed in the bathroom with the door closed and the light dim. Facilities uniform, steel-toed shoes that had cost him $40 at a discount outlet and had been resold once. He'd started wearing his wedding ring on a chain around his neck after the 3rd time a cleaning cart had knocked it off the bathroom counter. And now the habit was so old he barely noticed the weight. The apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator worked 60% of the time and the super came around when the month had been good to him. The 2nd bedroom belonged to Ethan. Daniel had taken the living room years ago, folding out the couch every night and making it up with real sheets, because he figured a person ought to sleep in something that had been made with intention. Ethan was 12. He'd been 8 when his mother left, not died. Left, and old enough to understand what it meant while being young enough that Daniel had never been entirely sure what narrative the boy had built around it. They didn't talk about Claire, not because Daniel had forbidden it, but because Ethan had stopped asking around the time he figured out that the answers didn't change anything, and the boy was constitutionally inclined toward the practical. He was a quiet kid. Not shy, his teachers were always careful to make the distinction, which Daniel appreciated but internally organized in a way that made noise seem like inefficiency. He kept a notebook where he wrote down things he wanted to look up later. He had finished the 6th grade math curriculum in March. He made his own lunch most days. Not because Daniel asked him to, but because he'd decided at age 10 that he was old enough and had simply begun doing it. Daniel worked a 5:30 a.m. start at Meridian Systems Group, a technology firm that occupied the top 11 floors of a downtown high-rise and considered itself important enough to employ 3 people, whose sole function was the care of the lobby. Italian marble. He worked the primary shift, which meant floors 28 through 38. Including the executive level. He was done by 2:30, home by 3, and had 40 minutes before Ethan came in from the bus. He spent those 40 minutes lying down on the couch without sleeping, because sleeping would mean he had admitted something about the state of his body that he wasn't ready to admit. He had a second job on Tuesdays and Thursdays, maintenance work for a property management company across town. Evenings only. Cash paid in a white envelope on the 1st and 15th. It kept them current on the rent. It kept his hands rough in the particular way that meant he was earning. He had not always cleaned floors. This was a fact Daniel held privately, the way a man holds a coin he no longer needs to spend but can't bring himself to throw away. He had been an engineer once. Systems architecture. He had written code that still ran. Somewhere, in infrastructure he'd never see again. He didn't think about it much, or rather, he had learned not to think about it in ways that led anywhere. He had come to Meridian as a custodian 3.5 years ago, through a temp agency that didn't ask many questions. The work was steady, the building was climate-controlled, the pay was $11 an hour more than the agency's other placements, because the firm's facilities manager had needed someone reliable who could also operate basic server room equipment and not panic about it. Daniel had fit the description without explaining why. He had kept his head down. He had learned the building's rhythms. He had watched, over 3.5 years, as Meridian hired and lost 2 CEOs and was now on its third. A woman who had taken the position 6 months ago and come in with the specific energy of someone who had been told the house was in order and had quickly determined that it was not. The cough had started in November. He had attributed it to the season, then to the cleaning solvents, then to poor sleep. By January, it had a sound he didn't like, a wet, settled quality that lived too deep in his chest for a seasonal thing. He hadn't seen a doctor because the copay was $60 and he was $63 from the end of the month. Ethan had noticed. He noticed everything, which Daniel simultaneously admired and found exhausting. The boy had started leaving glasses of water on the folding table beside the couch without being asked. He had moved Daniel's work shoes to the mat by the door, so his father wouldn't have to bend as far. He had not once mentioned the cough directly, which was the most telling thing of all. There was a rhythm to the building that most people didn't notice, because they arrived after it was already in motion. Daniel noticed. He knew which floors were cold by 6 a.m., and which were warm by 5:30, because of where the HVAC intake was relative to the exterior wall. He knew that the recycling in the 35th floor kitchen was always overfull on Thursdays because of the standing Wednesday afternoon team lunch that nobody ever properly cleared. He knew the janitor's closet on 29 had a light that flickered when the temperature dropped below 40 outside, and he had reported it to facilities twice and been told twice that it was on the list. He knew these things not because they were required for his job, but because paying attention was a habit he'd had since childhood and had never seen a good reason to break. His mother had called it a gift. His ex-wife had called it exhausting. He thought it was neither just something his brain did, the way some people's brains organized music or faces. His organized the behavior of systems, which was, of course, precisely what he had been paid, a very different salary to do in a very different context, before everything had gone sideways. He tried not to think about that in ways that had edges. The thinking itself wasn't the problem. The thinking about what might have been was. He was a practical man, and what might have been was not a practical framework. He focused on what was. On the morning of February 4th, a Wednesday, a new internal audit was scheduled to begin at Meridian Systems Group. The new CEO would be present. All facilities staff were required to complete their assigned floors before 8 a.m. and remain available for on-call service throughout the day. Daniel had read the memo 3 times, made sure his cart was fully stocked the night before, and set his alarm for 4. He had also, in a decision he had not examined too closely, told Ethan about the audit, the floor schedules, the supply closet codes, the name and disposition of Pete, the facilities manager, in the same offhand way he usually described his workday. He would later tell himself this was just the habit of narrating his day to his son. He was not entirely sure that was the whole truth. He collapsed at 4:48. Not dramatically, he didn't fall, didn't hit anything. He sat down on the bathroom floor because his legs sent a clear message that they were done for the morning, and the floor was as good a place as any to sit. His forehead was wet. The cough that followed the sitting down was the worst one yet, the kind that bent him forward and took 30 seconds and left him with his hands braced on the cold tile, and a taste in his mouth that he recognized as trouble. He sat there for a while. He thought about the math. It was an audit day. Facilities staff who missed an audit day without a same-day replacement were logged as unexcused. 2 unexcused absences in a rolling 90 days triggered a performance review. He had one already from the October day when the bus had broken down and he'd been 40 minutes late. That one had been logged as a half absence, and he'd thought, at the time, that the system's pedantry was the most exhausting thing about the job. He did not think that anymore. A performance review could mean termination. Termination meant no income from the primary job. The secondary job was cash, not reported, and wouldn't cover the rent. The rent was 3 weeks from due. He had done this arithmetic many times over the past 4 years, and it always arrived at the same place. The margin was thin enough that any one thing going wrong had the potential to start a cascade that ended with the two of them in a shelter. He was still sitting on the floor when the door opened. Ethan stood in the doorway in his pajamas. He looked at his father the way he looked at math problems without alarm, processing. "How long have you been on the floor?" the boy asked. "I just sat down." Ethan studied him for another moment, then went to the kitchen. He came back with a glass of water and 2 aspirin from the cabinet where Daniel kept aspirin. The same cabinet Ethan was technically not tall enough to reach without standing on the step stool. He had apparently resolved that problem at some point. Daniel took both. He said, "Go back to sleep. It's 5 o'clock." Ethan said, "You're supposed to leave in 20 minutes. I know. You can't go like this. I'll be fine in a few minutes." Ethan looked at him, not at the floor, at him, and said nothing. He went to Daniel's bedroom, came back with the work ID badge and the weekly schedule that was clipped to the refrigerator and the laminated floor assignment chart that lived in the front pocket of the cleaning cart. He set all 3 on the bathroom vanity and sat down on the edge of the tub. "Walk me through the floors," he said. It took Daniel a long moment to understand what his son was proposing. When he did, he said, "Absolutely not. You've described the layout to me enough times that I could probably do most of it from memory," Ethan said. "The cart is already loaded. You said it yourself last night. And it's a Wednesday. The executive floors get light service on Wednesdays because of the standing 7 a.m. leadership call. They just need the hallways done and the restrooms checked." Daniel stared at his son. "You've been paying attention to my work schedule." "I pay attention to things," Ethan said, which was simply true. There was a long silence. Daniel looked at the badge on the vanity, then at his son, then at the mirror above the sink where his own face looked back at him, feverish and pale, and deeply unconvincing. As a man who could stand up and do the next 8 hours. "I could lose this job if they found out," he said. "You could lose this job if you don't show up," Ethan said. They looked at each other. Daniel closed his eyes. He said, "The supply closet is on 31. The code is 4419. Don't use the freight elevator alone." He stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 5:15 with the uniform shirt on, and the sleeves rolled, and the badge clipped to the chest pocket, and the person looking back at him was not quite a child, and not one. He was tall for his age, which helped. His face was the problem. It was still a boy's face, unambiguous about it, and no amount of squared shoulders was going to change that. He took his backpack anyway, because leaving it felt wrong. He transferred his notebook to it. He left his school books. He put in a granola bar, and the key to the apartment, and his bus pass, and a folded piece of paper on which he had written, in his precise block handwriting, the floor assignments, and supply closet codes, and the name and extension of the facility's supervisor, a man named Pete, who, according to his father, would rather chew glass than escalate a situation to management. He took the bus downtown. It was still dark. The other passengers were construction workers, and a nurse, and an old man with a grocery bag, and nobody paid him particular attention, which he considered a good sign. He arrived at the Meridian building at 6:12, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk looking up at 38 floors of glass and steel. The exterior lights, still on against the winter morning, and felt something he would later have described as the particular weight of a decision after it has been made and before its consequences have arrived. The security desk was staffed by a man named Harold, who his father had mentioned twice. Harold looked up, looked at the badge, looked at Ethan's face, and looked at the badge again. "You Carter's kid?" he said. "Yes, sir." Harold looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the camera above his desk, then at the empty lobby behind him, then at Ethan again. "Your dad okay?" "He will be." Another pause. Harold pressed the buzzer without fanfare. Service elevators on the left. Cart's already up at 31. Pete loaded it last night. Stay out of the executive floor before 8:30 unless you get a call. He worked methodically. His father had described the job often enough, and he had listened in the specific way he listened to things, not to be polite, but because information seemed worth keeping. The mop had a particular ringing technique. The trash liners were the black ones for the offices, and the clear ones for the recycling. The executive restrooms on 38 got the good paper towels, the kind that came in a separate box. He did not think of himself, in those hours, as a 12-year-old doing something brave. He thought of it the same way he thought of finishing his homework before dinner, or making his lunch the night before, or being ready for the bus 7 minutes early, because being exactly on time was structurally indistinguishable from being late. It was a thing that needed doing, and he was the person available to do it. That was all. The math was not complicated. He worked slowly enough to do it right and fast enough to stay on schedule. On the 30th floor, a man in a good coat walked past him with the absent-eyed acknowledgement that adults gave to infrastructure, the same look people gave to fire extinguishers and light switches, aware enough to use them, insufficiently curious to think about where they came from. On the 32nd, a woman in the break room poured coffee and looked up and said good morning. And he said good morning back, and that was the entire transaction. He ate his granola bar in the service elevator between 33 and 34. He did not sit down on the floor to eat it, because that felt like the kind of thing you didn't do when you were representing someone else. An HR assistant passed him in the hallway on 34 and did a brief double-take. "How old are you?" she asked. "Old enough to do this hall before 7, he said, which wasn't exactly an answer but wasn't exactly not one either. She walked on. He mopped. By 8:15 he had completed floors 28 through 36 and had moved to 38. He could hear voices through the frosted glass of the main conference room the audit was already convening. Earlier than scheduled. He kept his cart back, out of range. He did the hallway in sections, moving quietly. He was replacing the liner in the bin at the end of the corridor when he heard the voice from inside raise itself several registers. "This is unacceptable. Someone find me the facilities contact and explain why this section was passed over." A woman's voice, controlled, but only just. He recognized the particular edge in it, the edge of someone who had decided, weeks ago, that enough was enough, and was now providing evidence. The facilities manager, a harried man named Pete, who had been doing this job for 11 years, and showed it, came to find Ethan at 8:42 with the look of someone who had already decided he wasn't going to think too hard about the situation. "You need to go in there and clear the corner section," Pete said. "Just the corner. There's a recycling bin that wasn't done, and someone noticed. Go in, do it quick, come out. Don't talk to anyone." "Okay," Ethan said, and for the love of Pete stopped. Started again. "If anyone asks you anything, you say Pete is your supervisor, and you'll have them connected to him directly." "Got it." He pushed the cart through the door. The room was large and lit, and populated by 7 people, who all turned at the same moment. Long table. Projector. Coffee service, on a credenza that hadn't been touched. The woman at the head of the table, dark suit, hair pulled back. A legal pad with very small handwriting on it looked up last. Ethan wheeled the cart to the corner, changed the bin liner, and was turning to leave when one of the directors said, in the tone of a man who found this mildly diverting, "Who sent the child?" 2 others smiled. The woman at the head of the table said, "Who are you?" Not unkindly, but directly. She was looking at the badge. Ethan turned. He had planned to say something about Pete. He had planned to deflect cleanly and go. Instead, he was not certain afterward why he told the truth. "My dad's sick," he said. "So I came instead." 3 of them laughed. It was not mean-spirited. Exactly, it was the laughter of people who had been in a tense meeting since 8 a.m. and welcomed the interruption. One of the directors shook his head with the faint, satisfied smile of a man who has just thought of an anecdote. Sophia Laurent did not laugh. She was still looking at the badge. "Carter. D." She looked up at the boy's face. She said, "And what is it that you can actually do?" The laughter was dying down. Everyone waited. The boy looked at her steadily and said the thing that changed the temperature of the room. "He told me," Ethan said, "that if the system fails again, you should check the mirror server. Like you did 8 years ago." Silence. Not the polite kind. The structural kind, the silence of a room in which something has just occurred that requires everyone to privately recalibrate before anyone can speak. Sophia's pen stopped moving. The director nearest her started to say something, and she raised one finger, very slightly, and he did not. She was looking at the boy, but she was not seeing him. She was somewhere else, 8 years back, sitting in a server room at 2 in the morning, watching a company's entire transaction architecture unspool in real time, and waiting for someone who was never going to arrive, and then someone arriving who she had not expected and could not have predicted. Mirror server. The words had a specific gravitational quality. She had not heard them in 8 years. She had not spoken them to anyone in 8 years. They were not in any document she had written. They were not in any after-action report she had been party to. They lived in the memory of one night and, apparently, in whatever a Meridian janitor named Daniel Carter had chosen to tell his 12-year-old son. She set the pen down. "What's your name?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Ethan. Ethan." She said it once, quietly, to herself. Then, "What did your father tell you, exactly, about the mirror server?" "He didn't tell me what it was. He told me the phrase to say." He said. Ethan paused, recalling. He said, "If things go wrong in the audit and the numbers don't add up, I should go to the CEO directly and say those words." He said she'd know what they meant. The room was perfectly still. One of the directors had put his pen down. Another had forgotten he was holding a coffee cup. Sophia Laurent stood up, walked to the window, and stood there for 10 seconds with her back to the room. When she turned around, her expression had changed in a way that was difficult to name. Something that had been closed had opened, or something that had been open had been rearranged into a different configuration entirely. She had been 28 and a junior director of infrastructure security at a company called Vantage Network Solutions, which no longer existed under that name because it had been absorbed during the exact crisis she was now remembering. The failure had begun on a Thursday evening. A cascading authentication collapsed, the kind of thing that happened when legacy systems had been patched too many times by too many different teams over too many years. And the whole structure became a house of repairs that nobody had thought to look at from the outside. At 10 p.m., the client-facing portals went dark. At 11, the internal reporting layer began producing errors. By midnight, the backup systems were behaving in ways that suggested the backup systems had been compromised in an update 6 months prior that no one had flagged. Sophia had been the one who stayed. The senior director had gone home at 9, confident in the team. The team had exhausted their protocols by 11:30 and were cycling through redundant steps with the focused helplessness of people who know they're out of ideas but can't stop moving. She had called everyone she could call. She had opened every manual in the drive. She had sat in that server room with the hum of 40 machines and a board decision in the morning and no solution. The man had appeared at 1:47. She didn't know his name. She hadn't asked. He was wearing a contractor badge that identified him as infrastructure support, and he came in with the quiet demeanor of someone who had heard the situation described through a wall and had decided, on his own authority, to look at it. He had asked her 3 questions. Then he had sat down at a terminal and done something to the configuration routing that she had watched but not fully followed, because his hands moved with the speed of someone who had done this particular thing before. She had been embarrassed, later, that she hadn't asked his name. At the time, it had felt like a luxury the moment couldn't afford. She was watching him work and running contingencies in her head simultaneously, calculating what she would tell the board in 4 hours if the systems didn't come back, running the math on careers and liability, and the exact sequence of who would be blamed for what in which order. She had not had the bandwidth for introductions. That was the story she had told herself. The truer version was that she had been frightened, genuinely, bone-level frightened, in a way she had not been before or since, and frightened people do not ask the names of the people who walk in and start fixing things. They just move out of the way and let it happen. The primary and backup are fighting each other, he'd said. You need to bring the mirror server up and route through it temporarily. It's not on the standard dock because it was set up as an emergency relay in 2009 and nobody updated the architecture map when the system expanded. But it's there. It had taken 31 minutes. At 2:18 a.m., the portals came back online. At 2:40, internal reporting normalized. She had turned to thank him, and he was already gone. She had stood in that room for another 10 minutes after he left. She had thought in the specific irrational way that comes with exhaustion and relief, and too much adrenaline that she should find him, that she should at least know his name. She had done nothing. The morning had arrived. The board meeting had happened. The crisis had become an anecdote, and the man from the server room had become a shape in her peripheral memory, present enough to matter, absent enough to let her forget exactly how much. The after-action report had credited the team. The senior director had presented the recovery at the board meeting and had been commended for it. Sophia had written her own account, which lived in a personal file she had never submitted, partly because she couldn't identify the man, and partly because submitting it would have required implicating a senior director in a misrepresentation that would have upended the company in the middle of a crisis it was already struggling to survive. Vantage had survived. Merged 2 years later. She had gone on. She had carried the shape of that night with her, the specific debt of it. The man whose name she had never learned. The 31 minutes that had changed the trajectory of her career, and she had let it become one of those debts you stop expecting to repay. She returned to the conference table. She looked at the boy standing by the cleaning cart, patient and composed, waiting to be either dismissed or interrogated, clearly prepared for either. Part 7. What the boy knew. Without knowing why. Your father, Sophia said. How long has he worked here? 3.5 years. And before that? Ethan paused. He did tech work. Infrastructure. He doesn't talk about it much. One of the directors leaned forward. Is there something your father told you specifically about our current systems? Anything else? Ethan thought about it. He said, carefully. He said that the reports people show in meetings often don't match what's actually happening in the raw data. He said you should never trust a summary when you can look at the source. The room absorbed this. Sophia looked at the lead auditor, a compact woman named Dr. Price, who had been running internal reviews for 15 years and had the expression of someone who recognized the shape of a truth, even when she hadn't been the one to find it. Pull the raw transaction logs from the last 90 days, Sophia said. Not the consolidated reports. The source files. Dr. Price was already opening her laptop. The director across from her, a man named Galbraith, who handled systems oversight, was very still in his chair. There may be a latency issue in the he began. Then we'll wait for it to resolve, Sophia said, in the tone that ended things. The source files, when they appeared, told a story that the consolidated reports had been quietly smoothing over for 4 months. It was not the kind of thing that happened by accident. It was the kind of thing that required someone with access and intent to manually adjust reconciliation thresholds in a reporting layer that most people in the room didn't know existed. It was, Sophia recognized with a specific cold clarity, the same class of error she had watched metastasize at Vantage 8 years ago. Different implementation. Same logic. Someone deciding that a problem was easier to conceal than to solve. Ethan had been watching this from near the door. He did not fully understand what was happening. He understood enough. The IT team arrived on 38 at 9:40. There were 4 of them, 2 of whom were visibly uncomfortable in the way of people who had been brought to a meeting they hadn't been told the subject of. Sophia walked them through the discrepancy in language that was precise and unhurried. And one of them, a young woman named Torres, who had been at the company 8 months, pulled up a secondary interface and began working through the reconciliation layer from a different angle than anyone had tried. The bug is in the threshold logic, Torres said. It's not a random error. Someone changed the tolerance parameters so the reconciliation would smooth over anything under a certain value instead of flagging it. Over 90 days that adds up to, she did the calculation and went quiet for a moment. It adds up to a significant number. When was the parameter changed? Sophia asked. Torres checked the log, gave a date, gave an access credential. Galbraith stood up from his chair, said something about a prior commitment, and was leaving the room when Sophia said his name, just his name. Once, and he stopped. Sit down, she said. He sat. Ethan, by now, had moved to the corridor just outside the open door. He was leaning against the wall with his backpack at his feet and his notebook open on his knee. He had been writing in it, not notes exactly, more like the shorthand of observation he had been developing since he was 9 years old. A system that no one else could parse, but that worked well enough for him. Torres came to the door at some point and looked at him. "You really came in to cover for your dad?" she said. "He has a secondary absence on his record," Ethan said. "I didn't want him to lose the job." Torres considered this. She was 27, 8 years removed from a version of herself that had also done inadvisable things for reasons that made complete sense from the inside. "The floors look good, by the way," she said. "Whatever he taught you." Ethan nodded once and looked back at his notebook. At 11:15, Sophia came to the door and looked at him. "Your father. Is he at home?" The building was on Ellsworth, which Sophia's driver navigated without incident. She had the Ethan's address from the HR file. She had pulled it herself, quietly, while the legal team was being assembled on the floor below. She had also pulled the full employment record of one Daniel Carter. Facilities maintenance, level 2 clearance. Start date 3 years, 7 months, 2 weeks prior. Prior to that, a gap of 18 months, listed as contract work, various. Prior to that, a position at a firm called Vantage Network Solutions, job title listed as Senior Infrastructure Engineer, departure date, 14 months before Vantage's absorption. Reason for departure, listed, with the careful vagueness of a settlement agreement, as mutual separation. She had read this in the car and put the phone face down on the seat and looked at the street outside the window for a long moment. Ethan had come down with her. He sat in the front seat and gave directions, which he knew from taking the bus. The building was the kind of building that had been decent once and was still livable if you had no alternative standard of comparison. The elevator, Ethan noted, was out of service today. He said this matter-of-factly, without apology, so they walked up 4 flights. The stairwell smelled of old cooking and detergent. The overhead light on the 3rd floor was out. Ethan unlocked the door. Called out quietly. "Dad. Someone's here." The apartment was small and tidy in the particular way of places that are kept up by someone who understands that neatness costs nothing. There was a folded blanket on a couch that served as a bed, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, and a stack of Ethan's schoolwork, a bookshelf that was too full, with a second row of paperbacks stacked flat on top of the upright ones. On the refrigerator, a photograph of a younger Daniel holding a very small Ethan at what appeared to be a county fair. Daniel Carter was sitting up in the narrow second bedroom, propped against the headboard with the focused stillness of a person trying very hard to project more functionality than he possessed. He was pale in the way that came from several nights of insufficient sleep compounded by fever. He was wearing a flannel shirt because the room was cold. When Sophia came through the door behind his son, he looked at her face, really looked at it, and went still in a different way entirely. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Laurent." His voice was steady, which probably cost him something. "You know who I am. I've been at Meridian 3.5 years. I make it a point to know the building." She sat down in the single chair by the window. Ethan stood in the doorway. "Neither in nor out. Vantage Network Solutions," she said. "February, 8 years ago." Daniel looked at his hands. "I was there that night," she said. "I was the one in the server room." A long silence. Outside, a bus went past. The sound of it was familiar and ordinary, and entirely insufficient to the moment. "I know," he said. "You knew who I was when I came to Meridian. It's a small industry," he said. "And I looked you up." A pause. "I figured you didn't remember me." "Nobody remembered me. That was the point. I was just trying to do my job." "Your job that night was maintenance," she said. "Not systems recovery." He looked up at her. There was something in his expression that she recognized, not bitterness exactly, but the settled weight of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has made peace with the carrying. "I heard someone in trouble," he said. "I knew how to help, so I did." "And afterward? When you were pushed out? When your record was—" She stopped. "After I fixed the system," he said quietly. "I filed a report about the vulnerability that had caused it. The vulnerability had been flagged 2 years earlier by a different team and closed without action by a VP who didn't want to budget the remediation. When I made that report, it became somebody's problem. I was the easiest solution. The chair by the window was very quiet. No, Sophia Laurent said. You saved my career, and I didn't know your name. The conversation that followed was long and did not go easily. Daniel Carter was not a man who received things gracefully. He had spent 4 years perfecting the practice of not needing anything from anyone, not because he didn't feel the need, but because he'd found that the distance between need and help was exactly wide enough to hurt you if you tried to cross it. He told her he was fine. She told him his employment record at Meridian would not be affected by today. She told him she had flagged his absence as an approved medical leave, retroactive to this morning. He said that was generous and that he appreciated it. She said there was also the matter of his original employment. She had, this morning, requested a review of the Vantage separation agreement from Meridian's general counsel, who had contacts at the acquiring firm. She was not in a position to undo what had been done 8 years ago, and she told him so clearly, because she thought he would respect honesty more than a promise she couldn't keep. But the record, as it stood, was wrong, and she had the standing to say so, in writing, in a context that would be useful to him if he wanted it to be. I don't need anyone to fight my battles, he said. I know, she said. This isn't a battle. It's a correction. There's a difference. Ethan, still in the doorway, said nothing. He had been watching his father's face through all of this, with the same focused patience he brought to everything, not pressing, not retreating, just present. Daniel looked at his son. Then at the woman in the chair. He said, he took the bus downtown at 5 in the morning. Alone. To mop floors. I know, she said, because he thought I needed him to. I know, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face not collapsed. Not softened exactly, but shifted, and he said, all right. Tell me what you're proposing. 2 weeks later, the quarterly review meeting at Meridian ran long. The audit findings had triggered 3 internal investigations, 1 regulatory notification, and a board presentation that Sophia had delivered without notes. She was not the kind of person who made speeches, but at the end of the presentation, she said the following. In the flat, clear register she reserved for things that mattered. The findings we're discussing today were possible because someone in this building understood something that the people paid to understand it had stopped actually looking at. He has been working in facilities for 3.5 years. His name is Daniel Carter. This company still stands, and continues to stand, because of people like him, and I want that said clearly, in this room, for the record. She did not bow, she did not make theater of it. She said it, and moved on to the next agenda item, because that was who she was. A woman who believed that the most meaningful acknowledgments were the ones that didn't linger on themselves. Daniel Carter took a medical leave of 2 weeks and came back to the building on a Tuesday. Cleared by his doctor and substantially more interested in rest than he had previously allowed himself to be. His new role, a systems consultant position that Sophia had created with the same efficient pragmatism she applied to most things, did not yet have a full scope of responsibilities, which he understood would be developed over time. He was not the kind of person to be comfortable with open-ended arrangements. He was trying to become, as his son had suggested on one of his better days, more comfortable with things being in process. On the morning he came back, he stopped by the security desk. Harold was there. Harold looked at the new badge, different color, different clearance level, same building, and said, "Your kid did good work, for the record." "I know," Daniel said. "Floors were cleaner than usual." Daniel laughed, not a big laugh. Just the small, real kind that comes from somewhere undefended. He took the elevator up. The new office was on the 35th floor, in a corner space that had been used for overflow storage, before Sophia had it cleared. It had a window that faced east, and a desk that was still too large for a man who had spent 4 years working with a cleaning cart. He was getting used to it. He'd put a single photograph on the desk, the one from the refrigerator, the county fair. Ethan very small in his arms, and that was enough to make the space feel inhabited rather than borrowed. There were days when the transition felt like a translation he was still working on. He knew the language but was still discovering the idioms. He had been brought in initially to assess Meridian's infrastructure vulnerability, documentation, which was exactly the kind of work that should have been done 2 years prior, and hadn't been because it required someone willing to be unpopular with the people whose systems were being documented. He was, as Sophia had noted in her own dry way, quite good at being unpopular when the situation required it. He ate lunch in the cafeteria on 29, which was where the facility's staff ate. This was not required of him. He did it because he knew those people knew their schedules, and their running complaints about the freight elevator and the supply closet light on 31, and because he thought continuity had value, and that moving to a different floor did not require pretending you had always been there. Pete, the facilities manager, had told him on the third day, "You know you don't have to eat down here anymore." And Daniel had said, "I know," and that had been the end of it, because Pete was a man who understood that some decisions were not up for further discussion. Ethan came to visit the building once, on a Saturday in March, when the offices were quiet. Daniel walked him through the floors, the supply closet on 31, the executive conference room where the whole thing had begun, the east-facing window on 35. Ethan stood at the window for a while and looked at the city laid out below it, which was the same city he had taken the bus through alone in the dark on a February morning, though it looked different from up here. "It's the same building," Ethan said, which was a statement of fact that also wasn't. "Yes," Daniel agreed. And they stood there for a while, the two of them, looking east at the morning. Epilogue. The school sent Ethan's standardized test scores home in April, a thin envelope that he opened at the kitchen table while his father made dinner. He looked at the numbers for a while, then he put the envelope on the table between them. Daniel looked at the numbers. He set down the spoon. "You've been sitting on this." "I wasn't sitting on it. It came home today. These scores put you in the qualifying range for the Harrison academic program," Daniel said. "I know," Ethan said. "I looked it up." His father looked at him across the small kitchen table. The refrigerator ran. The window let in the smell of early spring from the street 4 floors below exhaust, and something that might have been cut grass from the park 2 blocks over. "We'll figure out the application," Daniel said. "I've already started the essay," Ethan said. "What's it about?" Ethan considered this. "It's about what it means to know how to do something and choose to do it anyway. Even when nobody asks you to. Even when nobody's watching." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He picked up the spoon. He went back to the stove. "That's a good essay," he said. 3 months later, a short letter arrived from Sophia Laurent's office. Not a formal document, not corporate letterhead. A personal note, on plain paper, addressed to Ethan Carter. It said, "Your father is one of the most capable people I have encountered in 20 years of this work. I hope you already know that, but I also want you to know this. What you did on February 4th, showing up, doing the work, saying the thing that needed to be said, that was not something you learned from a textbook. You showed up for someone who mattered to you, and in doing so you changed something that had been wrong for a very long time." Ethan read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in the notebook with the block handwriting, between a page of math notes and a page where he had written, on a morning in February before anyone else was awake. "Supply closet, 31st floor, code 4419. Don't use the freight elevator alone." He closed the notebook and went to set the table for dinner. Some things don't need more ceremony than that. Daniel came home that evening later than he used to. The new job had different hours, office hours, which still felt slightly foreign to him, like wearing good shoes on a trail. He found the table set and a pot of rice on the stove, and Ethan at the kitchen table with his laptop open, doing something with a spreadsheet that appeared to involve data he had not been assigned in school. "What is that?" Daniel asked. "Building energy consumption data," Ethan said. "The city publishes it. I'm looking at the correlation between maintenance frequency and HVAC efficiency in commercial buildings over 10 stories. He paused. "I thought it might be interesting." Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, still in his coat. "You just decided to do this," he said. "On your own." It looked like a solvable problem. Daniel took off his coat. He hung it by the door on the hook he'd installed himself 2 winters ago, at a height that had been right for him then, and was now slightly too low for the boy who kept growing whether Daniel was paying attention or not. He made a mental note to move it up. Then he sat down across from his son and looked at the spreadsheet. "Your methodology is off," he said. You're controlling for building age, but not occupancy load, which means your correlation is probably inflated. Ethan looked at the screen, then at his father, then back at the screen. "Show me," he said. Daniel pulled his chair around to Ethan's side of the table. The rice would need another 10 minutes. Outside, the evening came on in the gradual way of late spring, the last of the light gone from the street, the building across the way beginning to put its windows on, floor by floor, as people came home and turned on lamps, and made their own small circles of warmth against the dark. Some things, it turned out, were not behind them. Some things were simply continuing, in the way that good things do quietly, without announcement, in the same ordinary light, where everything else happened.